Hello, this lecture is on the Great Society, a symbolic economic event of the 1960s was a feature article on economist John Maynard Keynes and Keynesianism. This was in Time magazine, December 31st, 1965. In addition to Keynes' photograph on the cover, there was a lengthy and positive assessment of his impact on the United States. Keynes died in 1946, but his central theme continued to dominate American political thinking. It was the proper role of the government to intervene in the economy for capitalism to work at the highest level of efficiency. As Time explained, economic management in Washington was the new orthodoxy, and there were ample Keynesian economic experts teaching at American universities and advising politicians how government promoted growth and stability. There was no shortage of momentum in society for government to take a larger role in managing or fine-tuning the economy to obtain full employment. Major federal domestic programs increased from 40 to over 400 in the 1961 to 1969 period, causing one commentator to argue that the domestic side of the federal government has gotten so big that it was literally impossible to grasp it intellectually in its entirety. Lyndon Johnson was born in 1908 near the town of Stonewall, Texas. His school teacher mother pushed him to excel in school. He graduated from high school at age 16. After high school, he ran away from home, eluding the police and his father, who wanted him arrested as a runaway. He ended up in California, where he remained for almost a year, working as a clerk at his cousin's law office. Johnson's later claim of holding poorly paid jobs over a period of 2 years was pure myth-making, as was his claim that he hitchhiked the 1,500 miles back to Texas. When he returned, his parents pressured him to begin college, which he did at 19. They wanted him to read books and broaden his education at college, but he was reluctant to read books, a reluctance that continued throughout his adult life. Unlike many of his peers in federal politics, Johnson's college education was quite modest. A degree from the Southwest Texas State Teachers College, where the academic standards were lower than, say, at the University of Texas. Historian Robert A. Cairo writes of Johnson's insecurities and that he feared not being somebody at college. In the early 1930s, he took a job as the secretary of Texas Congressman Richard Kleberg. In 1937, he entered the House of Representatives, and 12 years later, he became a senator. Another 12 years later, he entered the White House as vice president in the Kennedy administration. On the tragic day of Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, Johnson became president, the first president from the South since the Civil War. The Keynesian revolution allowed Johnson to be somebody. There was money for his administration to do something big for the American people. Johnson was legendary for his ability to persuade allies and outmaneuver adversaries and few matched his prodigious energy. He drove his staff merciless, often to the point of complete exhaustion, and they learned of his irritation when they fell short of his demands. Johnson loved to eat, and his irritability was due in part to doctors putting him on a strict diet to control his weight. The legacies of Johnson include his great society of domestic programs. It was not radical enough for the emerging New Left, but it was a step in the correct direction. A man who worked with Johnson day and night for 3.5 years, Joseph Califano, wrote, "What Lyndon Johnson was about during his presidency was social and economic revolution, nothing less." Confident in the abilities of government to remedy the economic and social programs of the day, Johnson favored a type of corporatism of government working with business to bring prosperity. His great society offered major new social programs targeting healthcare, welfare, urban development, and education, to name only a few. Enacted by Congress in 1965, Medicare and Medicaid provided health care for older and poor Americans. In his first State of the Union address on January 8th, 1964, Johnson declared, "Let this session of Congress be shown as the session which did more for civil rights than the last 100 sessions combined, as the session which declared an all-out war on human poverty, as the session which finally recognized the health needs for all our older citizens, as the session which helped to build more homes, more schools, more libraries, and more hospitals than any single session of Congress in the history of our republic." With no fear of rising deficit spending, money was not a problem for Democrats. The hubris of Charles Schultz, Johnson's budget director, was standard fare. Schultz was positive that the government could prevent any major dips in the economy. With economists confident of lasting prosperity, Washington policymakers could afford to attack poverty with government programs designed by the best and brightest. The previous year, Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal told a Georgetown University audience that the United States needed a Marshall Plan to eradicate poverty in the nation. Public spending, not private enterprise, was the way forward to a prosperous nation and the eradication of destitution. An unconditional war on poverty in America made good economic sense to Johnson. The return of a $1,000 investment on an unemployed youth would be $40,000 in his lifetime. Johnson respected Keynesian stalwart John Kenneth Galbraith, who favored a new and independent agency to fight poverty. In a memo to the president, Galbraith advised, "Do not bury the program in the departments. Put it in the executive offices where people will know what you are doing, where it can have a new staff and a fresh man as director." Johnson agreed, and as an independent agency that reportedly reported directly to Johnson, handled the program. He wanted a strong man to lead the director, and he chose Sargent Shriver, John Kennedy's director of the Peace Corps. After meeting with experts from inside and outside the government, Shriver took the ideas on eliminating poverty and set up the office of the program in the old federal courts of claims. Perhaps a bad omen, the building was in disrepair and the poverty program moved to a bygone morgue in the basement of an abandoned emergency hospital. Shriver's people worked, Johnson wrote in his memoirs, with a fervor and created a ferment unknown since the days of the New Deal. Johnson approved the program on March 16, 1964, and sent it to Congress as the Economic Opportunity Act. Aggressively promoting the bill in an election year was the next important step, but one obstacle was the Republicans and Southern Democrats who opposed progressive legislation. Masterfully, Johnson and the Democrats pitched the war on poverty as a nonpartisan effort and the morally right thing to do for poor people. After visiting the scarred mountains of Appalachia, he had plenty of anecdotes of the American poor. One was Tom Fletcher, who lived in a tar-papered shack with his wife and 8 children, the 2 oldest forced out of school by poverty. The government was there to help the Tom Fletchers of America keep their children in school. In Washington, Johnson's speeches presented a simple and powerful message. People are just going to stand, people, quote, people are just not going to stand and see their children starve and be driven out of school and be eaten up with disease in the 20th century, end of quote. The Johnson government would not accept poverty. The people, quote, will forego stealing, and they will forego fighting, and they will forego doing a lot of violent things and improper things as long as they possibly can, but they are going to eat, and they are going to learn, and they are going to grow. The quicker you find it out, the better, end of quote. Government investment in human capital in the form of education and training paid dividends. A working class with greater opportunities to produce and earn meant a stronger nation. Passed in the Senate by a vote of 61 to 34 and by the House 226 to 185, the poverty bill illustrated the strength of progressive thinking. On August 20th, Johnson signed the Economic Opportunity Act and declared, quote, for the first time in all the history of the human race, a great nation is able to make and is willing to make a commitment to eradicate poverty among its people. Accepted was the idea that the American economy had unused potential. Economic growth was more than sufficient to absorb the cost of politician promises. The only challenge was deciding how to spend the growing national income. John Kenneth Galbraith, The Affluent Society, published in 1957, and Michael Harrington's The Other America, published in 1962, opened Joseph Califano's eyes to the injustice of a wealthy America. Califano was born in Brooklyn, New York. After high school, he attended the College of the Holy Cross, where he wrote his senior's thesis on F. Scott Fitzgerald, even though he graduated as a philosophy major, as was the case for all Holy Cross graduates at the time. His Jesuit education prepared him for Harvard Law School, where he was sixth academically out of 456 students in his second year. This remarkable academic performance earned him a spot on the Harvard Law Review. His mother was a devout Catholic who worried that the materialistic atheism of Harvard would have a bad influence on her son. She was also clear that it was World War II and not Roosevelt's New Deal that had turned the economy around. She read and then sent him a copy of William Buckley's God and Man at Yale that warned of the rampant secularism of Ivy League education. If Califano read Buckley, he showed no signs of adopting Buckley's economic ideas, which were free market rather than the intervention of government. As a young man, Califano enjoyed reading the most liberal paper in the city at the time, and that was the New York Post. He visited Catholic social activist Dorothy Day, drinking her awful tea and hearing her argue for a, quote, purified socialism, end of quote. Her ideology was a little too radical for him, but he had great faith in what experts working in government could achieve for society. The New Deal fascinated him, especially the role idealistic, bright young men could play in government. President John F. Kennedy had wanted to attract the best talent to government, and Califano was confident of his intellectual abilities to be one of those elite shaping America. Turning down a job offer to teach law at the University of Wisconsin, he was anxious to be a part of Kennedy's new frontier and have some impact on society. Califano began as a special assistant for Department of Defense General Counsel Cyrus Vance, arriving at the Pentagon in April 1961 when the building had no security checked. Califano had an embarrassing start. Vance forgot to tell his staff about Califano, and the young lawyer spent hours waiting in a nondescript burgundy chair, typical for high-level government offices. Did Califano make a mistake? With his first shaky day in the bureaucratic behemoth of the Pentagon behind him, he became a proud whiz kid, the label attached to the bright young men working for Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. His importance increased during the Lyndon Johnson administration while he worked as the special assistant to McNamara. He was a tough lawyer who played hard and tough as a troubleshooter, but he had higher moral standards than many in his Democratic political circle. He refused the request by White House aide Bill Moyers to lie to the media about the Democratic Party not reimbursing the Pentagon for Johnson's political trips on Air Force One during the 1964 campaign. Domestic policy became Califano's passion. As he wrote in his memoirs, quote, "Didn't law school expect its graduates, especially its law review editors, to run the country, as so many had during the New Deal?" Johnson recruited Califano to help push through the revolutionary goals of his Great Society program. Seeing it as a moral mandate, Califano embraced the idea of redistribution of wealth. Even as a practicing Catholic, he was comfortable with Johnson being the first president to push government involvement in the business of family planning at home and abroad. What mattered was the government's family policy meant less poverty. As Califano saw it, Johnson's domestic program saved America. The Harvard man had great faith in the role of government to legislate social justice. Quote, "There was no child we could not feed, no adult we could not put to work, no disease we could not cure, no toy, food, or appliance we could not make safer, no air or water we could not clean. Seeing hundreds of bills I worked on enacted into law, I believe I could do anything I put my mind to next." There you have it, the example of the best and brightest able to control, direct the American economy, but much more than that. While conservatives question the affordability of the Great Society programs, the pro-growth tax cut in 1964, initially proposed by President Kennedy in late 1962, gave taxpayers and businesses more after-tax income to spend on goods and services, thereby boosting the economy and giving the Johnson administration breathing room. Unfortunately, the benefits of Kennedy's tax cuts did not last. By late 1965, there were signs of inflation due to increased government expenditures on domestic and military programs. With living costs rising in 1965, workers demanded higher wages. The remedy for Johnson was the immediate government action of more taxation to cool an overheated economy. He disagreed with those who saw reduced government spending as the best strategy to hold inflation to an acceptable level. Given that most Americans oppose higher taxes, Johnson had no choice but to proceed carefully. In his State of the Union address of January 12, 1966, he called for automobile and telephone excise taxes and faster collection of tax payments from citizens and corporations. The added $6 billion in federal revenues from these measures was welcome news for Johnson. But less welcoming was the vigorous opposition of business leaders to these additional taxes. On March 30, not one of approximately 150 businessmen invited to a White House dinner supported Johnson's plan for a tax increase. Despite this resistance, Johnson pressed for a 6% surcharge to take effect by July of 1967. When July came with evidence of higher inflation than expected, he argued for a surcharge as high as 10%. To bolster his argument, Johnson pointed to racial injustice and deadly riots in American cities as proof for the need of additional taxation. Riots caused the death of 26 in the city of Newark and 43 in Detroit. On August the 2nd, in the final draft of tax legislation, with the consultation of Wilbur D. Mills, chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, the White House wrote, quote, "For we cannot turn our backs on the great programs that we have begun with such promise in the last 3.5 years. Nevertheless, we must move with determination to assure that those for whom these programs were begun are not robbed by the inflation that would accompany an unacceptable deficit." Repeatedly, Johnson pushed for the tax bill, but had difficulty explaining that it was a 10% tax on a tax, not a 10% increase of the income tax rate. He maintained that the tax surcharge was the most urgent issue facing the country next to peace in Vietnam and the world. When he told Americans on March 31st, 1968, that he would not run for another term as president, he also declared, quote, "The passage of a tax bill now, together with expenditure control that the Congress may desire and dictate, is absolutely necessary to protect this nation's security, to continue our prosperity, and to meet the needs of our people," end of quote. Aware that impassioned pleas were not enough to convince everyone, Johnson conceded that a $6 billion cut in spending might be a necessary compromise in order to reach the number of votes needed for Congress to pass the bill. When the bill went to the House, Johnson's staff predicted winning big or not at all. It was a good prediction. 268 voted yes, 150 no. With the Senate's approval, Johnson signed the 10% surcharge into law on June 28th. Johnson got his tax bill, and deficit spending continued to finance the Great Society, but inflation remained a major concern. Business and workers paid little attention to the government's voluntary guideposts for wage and price controls. Johnson's dependence on the media to send his economic message directly to the American people did not stop him from calling reporters puppets who, quote, "simply respond to the pull of the most powerful strings," end of quote. He said there was, quote, "no such thing as objective news story." However, a media sympathetic to progressive policy is only helpful to a point. When it became obvious that the economy was in trouble, no amount of positive spin could hide inflation and joblessness. Some policy failures were too visible to ignore. For example, housing subsidies was a government program with a dismal record in New York City and for cities coast to coast. In 1965, the Johnson administration created the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which grew to almost 20,000 employees and dispersed billions of dollars on housing programs. earning a reputation as hotbeds of crime. Public housing projects failed one after another. Commenting on housing conditions in a low-income area of Los Angeles, one man concluded that public housing was, quote, the worst thing that ever happened to Watts. That's referring to that community in Los Angeles. As expected, conservatives delivered harsh assessment of Johnson's administration. With dramatic language, William Simon wrote of the shattering deficits, inflation, and the transfer of, quote, torrential sums of non-existent cash to the pockets of the poor, whose numbers and needs multiplied under the attentive supervision of the new poverty professional, end of quote. Johnson's prosperity without parallel in American history was mostly, quote, a vast speculative and inflationary bubble blown up by devalued money and by ravenous spending, ravenous borrowing from the capital markets, and fed by a war without end from which victory had been barred, end of quote. Helping the poor man was a noble aim, but were programs effective in assisting and strengthening families where they fiscally responsible when the national economy was at risk of inflation? Friedrich Hayek pointed to the oversimplified Keynesianism as much as the cause of much of the inflation of the post-war years. In some circles, the shine of Keynesianism and the Phillips curve diminish when unemployment and inflation failed to act like a playground seesaw, one going up while the other went down. Keynesians argued that higher unemployment meant less upward pressure on wages and prices, and lower unemployment, meaning when there were more jobs, meant an increase in wages and prices due to the tighter labor market. The Keynesian approach to fighting inflation was for the government to decrease the amount of money. So you have high inflation, thus you decrease the amount of money to fix that problem. To stimulate employment, Keynesians desired that the government do the opposite and increase the amount of money. Well, Keynesian policymakers were at a loss. How could the government intervene and put money in the pockets of consumers to fight stagnation while decreasing the amount of money in consumers' pockets to fight inflation? This quandary became more obvious in the 1970s, and what policymakers, politicians, and the American society had to face and deal with, that was inflation. They had the problem, the issue of stagflation. That is the combination stagnant economy and high inflation. Thank you.